I'd like to acknowledge both Jess Gowdy and Michelle Reeves, who've been very important in the success of this project and the current one that we have. I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving some background and then a brief summary of the key results from the project that has been funded by AWF, and a little bit of follow-up after that. And I hope I've had plenty of time for discussion afterwards. We know from a national random survey of English sheep farmers in 2004 that the average prevalence of lameness was around 10%, so around 10% of sheep lame at any one time. By 2013, when we repeated that questionnaire to a different random sample, but still of English sheep farmers, that prevalence of lameness had fallen by half to around 5%. And in fact, that's more than you would expect in most flocks, because there are a few flocks with high levels of lameness. So on average, when we go to a sheep flock, we would hope that it's 3.5% or fewer sheep lame. So we have some success already in reducing the levels of lameness in sheep. In 2011, the Farm Animal Welfare Committee proposed that by 2016 we should have a target of 5%. And by 2021, that target should be under 2% of sheep lame at any one time. So we are on target, we do have more to do, but it is, I think, a very good news story for sheep. So one of the key things we found from our research is that if we treat sheep within 3 days of becoming lame, then not only do the sheep recover without any reduction in productivity, but also because most of the lameness is caused by Dichelobacter nodosus, which is a bacterial disease, and so it's infectious, it prevents onward transmission of disease. So this rapid treatment is useful both to reduce the prevalence and the incidence of disease. And by 2015, 50% of farmers who responded to our survey reported that they were catching and treating sheep within 3 days of becoming lame. One of the other areas of research that we've done is to look at the different methods of treatment of sheep with foot rot. We had 50 sheep which had been lame for up to 2 weeks, and we treated them in a combination of antibiotic injection and spray, only a topical spray, an injection, a trim and a spray, and a trim and a spray. And what we find is that it's sheep which are given an antibiotic injection and spray, so this group here, that recover the fastest. So within 5 days, 70% of sheep are no longer lame. And in contrast, if the sheep are given a foot trim and a foot spray, which is the traditional treatment that we were all recommended, or at least I was and people of my era, only around 10% of sheep have recovered within 5 days. If you roll on another 5 days, nearly all the sheep that are given an injection and spray have recovered, but only about 30% of those that have had a foot trim and a foot spray. So we know that the best treatment for foot rot is an antibiotic injection and a topical spray with no trimming of diseased feet. One reason that we have this problem with the diseased feet is an example here. This was a farm that I visited in 2013, and the farmer was trimming feet when a sheep was lame with foot rot, and then 5 days later, if the sheep was still lame, he was trimming the foot again. And by the time I saw this foot, all the horn had been removed right the way up to the coronary band on both feet. And what you can see is there's still active infection there, and if you could scratch and sniff, that would smell like foot rot. And it takes months for this hoof horn to grow back down again. So these sheep partly remain lame because they're being asked to walk on sensitive tissue, but also because they get reinfection with disease. So the good news is that we've got a reduction in the proportion of farmers always trimming feet when they're lame, but it's very ingrained. You talk to farmers and they say, I really feel I need to trim those feet. They have a very ingrained feeling that it's the right thing to do. But we are managing to reduce the proportion of farmers who are trimming feet when they're lame. What we also find is that routine foot trimming, which if anyone can tell me why we're routinely foot trimming, I'd be really interested to know. I thought it had been happening for centuries, but I was told recently it wasn't started until the 1980s. We've had an association for a long time with the more times farmers were routinely foot trimming feet, the higher the level of the lameness in the flock, and we didn't understand why this was. And in our 2013 survey, we finally wrote the question, do you trim the feet routinely? Yes, no. If yes, how many times a year, when you trim, what proportion of sheep bleed, and from that we calculated out that routine foot trimming and causing the feet to bleed is the reason why we're seeing this relationship between routine foot trimming and higher levels of lameness. And a key issue with over-trimming and causing feet to bleed are the development of these granulomas. This is a particularly nice photographically aesthetic one. They can occur at any area around where the hoof-horn junction is damaged and sensitive tissue is exposed, and you get a granulomatous growth. So these feet, the sheep are in a lot of pain. They remain lame for a long period of time. Some of our farmers are reporting that 20% of feet bled when they were doing a routine foot trim. And our calculation at the moment is that of the 5% average that we're seeing of sheep lame, 30% of them are lame because they've been over-trimmed through routine foot trimming. When we compare flocks where a farmer says there's no bleeding that occurs when they do a routine foot trim with those that aren't routine foot trimming, there's no difference in lameness, which rather suggests that routine foot trimming is unnecessary. Given how long it takes, given that farmers say they'd really rather not do it, I think we can safely say it's something that we would recommend that farmers don't do anymore. And the reason it probably isn't necessary comes from some work that we did. This is the 8 different claws of 99 sheep, the average growth. So along the base here we have the sole of the foot, and when the lines are above the zero, the wall horn is longer than the sole horn, and when it goes below, it's below. So what we see in the autumn is sheep tend to have long toes and a long wall. It goes down as we go into cold weather and hard weather in the winter, where the horn is worn away. And as it gets warm again and the ground gets wet again, then the wall horn and the toe horn get longer again. So in fact, there is a natural cycle of length of hoof horn going up and down through the year. And it's around 5 or 6 centimetres that the horn will grow over the year. And you can imagine a farmer isn't trimming 5 to 6 centimetres away. And these feet will naturally get longer and shorter without any foot trimming. Having given you that, that's about 15 years of research I've just summarised there in 5 minutes. What we wanted to do was say, well, we've gone a long way, but we actually know we have some hard-to-reach farmers. In the studies that we'd been doing, we had farmers with higher than 5% lameness in the flock. Was there something we could do to work with those farmers to understand a little bit more about why they were having problems adopting some of the recommendations that we were making? So we wanted to design a practical lameness control programme, understand how we could reduce the levels of lameness further, revise that plan, and then roll the material out for use to as many people who we could as possible. So what we did was we took our understanding of factors associated with lameness in sheep and coded them as activities were likely to have high impact, so they were highly effective. They'd reduce lameness considerably if farmers could adopt them. Medium impact would be the medium factors. Low impact were the factors where we either knew they had little effect or actually the evidence was just very inconclusive. We enrolled 44 flocks, and you can see on the map they were distributed around England. We targeted in particular middle-sized flocks, so 100 to 500 ewes, partly because the average flock size is around 200, so that was sensible. We know these farmers don't farm sheep as a full-time job. And that's one of the things we were very aware of, is that if you're not on the farm all the time, there are other things that get in the way of doing treatment within 3 days, for example. These were, as I say, our non-compliant farmers. They were farmers who had been working with us in a couple of previous studies and hadn't yet adopted recommendations that we knew were effective. They all had at least 5% lameness, if not higher. They had 7 visits, starting in August of 2014 and the final visit in April of 2016. At each visit, the locomotion score of the sheep in the flock was recorded, the management the farmers were doing were made. After the first visit, half the farms were randomly assigned to receive recommendations to change, which Jess went onto the farms and I think very much, I hope, in a facilitative way, sat with the farmer to discuss how they thought they could make and implement the changes. And then the second group, we did that after the 5th visit. So we staggered the uptake of the recommendations. At the end of 12 months, I met with all of the farmers, and we had sort of a round-robin discussion about how they felt things had gone, and what they liked and what they didn't like, and where they were going to go for the next year. So this is the prevalence of lameness over the 7 visits. The red and the blue are just the 2 groups. So our red group received the intervention first, and then the blue group. And we can see that all was going really rather well until visit 5, particularly the group which had received the intervention at the 2nd visit. Each visit we saw a reduction in lameness down to just above 4%. And then towards the end of the study, we had a rise in lameness levels again. So February 2016, I don't know if you can remember that autumn and winter, but that was one of the very, very wet autumns and winters that we saw. And in fact, although this looks like an average, what we found was a group of farmers continued to be able to control lameness, and another group were unable to keep control of lameness. And a lot of those were housing sheep in very wet conditions, and the lameness levels went up very rapidly. When we analysed the data, we found that these farmers were already doing a lot of the things that we'd recommended. So none of them were routine foot trimming. Nearly all of them were treating either within 3 days, but certainly all were treating sheep within a week. They were comfortable about using an antibiotic injection and spray. Some of them found it hard to do that within a week treatment, and often these were farmers who had patches of land rather than a coherent farm with boundaries, and they were using electric fencing, and so catching sheep was very difficult within 3 days without losing all the sheep through the electric fencing. But one of the things that they were able to do was, when they did treat sheep, they would remove them from the group. And this was something that came through, which we hadn't identified before, was in fact that in this sort of study, I should say, that being able to take away the lame sheep and keep them separate until they'd recovered was associated with lower levels of lameness. So this tells us that, in fact, these sheep remain infectious even after treatment. So separation is another biosecurity type activity that we can do to reduce onward transmission of disease. We also found, because these were flocks with high levels of lameness where they were not doing a lot of the activities, they tended to have quite a high level of sheep that were lame all the time. And so culling sheep, which was something they were quite reluctant to do initially, did have a very large effect on levels of lameness. And we had one flock with quite a large number of sheep with toe granulomas, which once they were removed, the level of lameness plummeted. But we did find, on average, that culling, once ewes had been lame twice within the year with footrot, was associated with a lower level of lameness. So, as I've mentioned, separation reduces onward spread of footrot. We had a little inkling of this from some previous work we did way back in 2000, when only 7% of farmers reported that they did separate lame sheep, but we saw an association with a lower level of lameness. So around half the farmers who reported in our previous studies in 2013 and 14 were separating at some times of year. Clearly, it's very difficult to separate a lame ewe from young lame lambs if you can't match the groups up. So it's not feasible all the time throughout the year, but something that, when it can be done, is effective. And the other clear thing is that culling requires accurate record keeping. So for some farmers, this can be through EID, but actually just putting a spot on the leg that's affected with a decent spray can tell you whether a sheep has been lame before, and if there are 2 spots, then that's sort of a mark for time to move on and move out. So we've finalised our lameness control plan from this. We're just about to put it onto our website. It's 4 pages. Those of you who've done the mastitis control plan, it's sort of got the must, should, could type of advice. There's space at the bottom to write out what the plans might be. And we've produced an extremely detailed guide, which is just on the photo up here. That also is that's a PDF that's available online. And what we continue to do, as we've done for many years, is update that as the research progresses. So one of the things I should also say is, when I asked the farmers why they were compliant, why they were changing what they were doing. A lot of it was about the fact that Jess was visiting the farm 4 times a year, and there was some pride in keeping going and knowing that she was coming, and they were going to keep making the changes because of seeing her. So we do have a role when we go onto farms and make some investments. So one of the things our farmers said was they didn't have a good way of recording lameness. Sheep farmers are notoriously unkeen on computers, but I'm sure you will know that they are actually welded to their mobile phones. And so Jess, who was running the project, came up with an idea of developing a very simple app to record lameness that we can link to computers and so on. This app, we then had further funding from the foundation, and we are halfway through this year's project where we're finalising this app. As I speak, we are doing the internal glitches, and if I can persuade Warwick University that farmers are safe, we will be able to roll it out. We're having some security issues with accessing data and data confidentiality, and you can imagine with the situation at the moment that security is a really important issue to get right. We will roll this out to some farmers who are waiting to receive the app and have a go, but we have further activity where we will roll it out. We're working with AHDB beef and lamb, so ultimately we can roll it out through that route. I understand the app was presented at the International Lameness Conference a couple of weeks ago, so we are nearly there, so please watch this space and do encourage clients to use it if they're currently not using a system to record lameness. And this will, as I say, go into our larger website where we can both send farmers information summarising history of lameness, activities and so on. They will be able to access their own raw data should they wish to. And we're creating some fairly simple summary reports so that, and sort of some nudges and suggestions to help out if we can see there's been maybe not a lot of activity treating lame sheep. So I would just like to thank the sponsors, University of Warwick colleagues who've helped with this, AHDB who've done a little bit of the funding. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. I think this holistic approach is really going to be critical to moving ahead with sheep lameness and obviously improving their welfare. So we've had quite a few questions come in, and many are on a similar theme, and clearly members of the audience are getting the message about antimicrobial resistance. So I think the summary of the questions is a sort of justification for early intervention with antibiotic treatment. I think perhaps the issue is not no antibiotic use or no antibacterial use, but responsible use, and perhaps that's the angle that this is approaching.
Absolutely. So I have thought a lot about this. We are dealing with a bacterial disease, so antibiotics are an appropriate treatment. Treating within 3 days does 2 things. One is it reduces the number of treatments that will be needed across the flock because you're not allowing the disease to spread. So this isn't just a treatment for the diseased sheep, it's a prevention for sheep that won't go on to be lame. We have looked at if the sheep only has scald, so the first stages of foot rot, do they need an injection? The problem with leaving them and only using a topical spray is that a proportion of those sheep go on to develop foot rot within the week. So the bacteria is clearly underrunning and penetrating, although we don't see the clinical sign of it. So those sheep that you turn over and the farmer says, oh, she's really lame and she's only got a tiny amount of scald, probably there's a lot of inflammation and infection, but the hoof horn capsule hasn't popped away at that point. So in fact, you use the least antibiotics by doing rapid treatment. You use the most antibiotics if once a fortnight you go through all the lame sheep and inject them with antibiotic, because that doesn't help in reducing the prevalence of disease at all. So this is very much an appropriate considered use. We've also always used oxytetracycline, which I think is a fairly standard antibiotic in veterinary practice. And I would encourage people to use the sorts of antibiotics that are not of risk to human health and are appropriate for the treatment. Oxytetracycline, broad-spectrum penicillin types are fine.
Thank you. I think that an allied question that's come in is the prevalence of use of anti-inflammatory analgesics in the treatment of lame sheep. It's probably not common practice. What do you think about that?
So in the study I showed you, we tried looking at analgesics, and I have to say, I think only 10 of the sheep were randomly assigned to get analgesics, so there wasn't an effect, but that could have been a power issue. But one of the things is that the reason that these sheep are so lame is that they have inflamed feet, and it's a massive inflammation with neutrophils. And the antibiotic treatment immediately takes that inflammation away. And so the reason that so many of them, and a large proportion actually recover in 2 days, let alone 5 days. So I would never say to a farmer, don't use the anti-inflammatories, but I think we should bear in mind that the antibiotic is actually behaving in a way that's very useful to cure the disease. I have also discovered, I don't know if you know this, but oxytetracycline apparently is a wonder drug. It's not only an antibiotic, but it is an anti-inflammatory and it is an analgesic. So it may well be that because we're using the oxytetracycline that's having an effect too.
Okay, so there's some questions about sort of behavioural change, and in fact it fits in with the first presentation we've heard this afternoon. So there are a number of things that farmers might adopt in terms of their practice. What are the sort of easiest things to get them to change their practice with, and what are the most ingrained things that are harder to get them to do?
So I can tell you what has changed most. So what has changed most is the routine foot trimming. We knew from questionnaires that we'd done quite a long way back that farmers told us they didn't want to routine foot trim. So I guess us saying it's not doing any good, they just go, phew, thank goodness. But a lot of the way we do the work is we will work with a group of farmers, maybe on a farm event or at an evening meeting. And what I now do is, if someone in the audience is sceptical, I will just say, amongst the farmers there, who of you have stopped doing this or started doing that? And I know that about 50% of them these days will put their hand up. And it is actually one farmer telling another farmer that has the biggest influence. You know, who am I to say anything? I've never had a sheep flock. But when they hear it from another farmer, that's something that will influence them. And I'm pretty sure of the evidence that we've got. And so I'll challenge farmers who don't think they want to use the injection and spray and they want to carry on trimming these diseased feet and cutting out large bits of hoof horn, to go away and try. You know, the next 6 lame sheep you've got, do 3 my way, 3 your way, and see what happens. And I learnt that trick because that's what a very sceptical farmer did. And he came back and he told me, and he said, I'm now convinced you're right. So I would say these are such easy messages that to an extent you can say to a farmer, just try it and see. You know, if you don't routinely trim your feet, what's going to happen? You can do it next month, the month after, and you find that they will slowly move over to the new ways of doing things.
Thank you. We've got Anthony's asked a question about evidence for the efficacy of topical foot sprays. Is there any evidence for that, Laura?
Unpublished, but yes. So 2 things. One is that we've done some work so we can count the number of bacteria on the foot, so we can count the number of Dichelobacters. And a sheep that has foot rot actually has higher levels of the Dichelobacters on all 4 feet, not just the foot where you might see disease. So we do recommend that all 4 feet are treated. And we have a PhD student at the moment just analysing some data. And we see that the topical treatment leads to reduction in the load of Dichelobacters for the next 2 weeks as the sheep recover from disease. And that was compared with a sheep that would be given an antibiotic injection for another reason and no topical spray, where we don't see a change in the load. So the topical spray is killing the local bacteria.
Okay, thank you. Everybody's obviously getting very used to the Slido because I can't see any hands waving and we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. So well done everyone for that. So we're going to have to draw this to an end in a second. There's one more sort of technical question I think might be of interest to many people, and that's how do we know if we pulled a sheep out for treatment when it's not likely to be contagious again and can return to the flock?
So that there is a very good correlation between being lame and having lesions. So once they stop being lame, you can check the feet. But what I would say is it's probably best that if a farmer's pulling them out, to return them as a group rather than returning dribs and drabs. And I would disinfect the feet before turning them back in, just to do that extra check.
Great, well thank you very much, Laura. That's really exciting stuff. We'll look forward to the next phase of the work, and I think it's got a great potential to improve the lives of millions of sheep, so thank you very much.
Thank you.